Recently I did a video talking about paid reviews and my opinion on them, and in it I mentioned how I prefer to hear what the reviewer thinks of a piece of gear than what I think listening to a demo. And a lot of people on that part disagreed strongly. So I thought I'd do a couple of experiments and show you why I think that tone demos on YouTube aren't particularly useful in showing what a piece of gear sounds like. Now before we get into it, there's a very long list of exceptions to this, and I'll mention a few now. For example, comparison demos, comparing two different amplifiers, or two pedals, or multiple guitar picks, or strings, or pickups. When you're changing one thing and hearing how those changes differ, that's totally valid. Another perfectly valid reason for demos being useful would be for educational purposes. A piece of gear that's quite complex, like a complex digital delay pedal with a lot of features, a demo is a demonstration of that and can help users work with that gear. And even just entertainment value. There's a lot of very entertaining demos that I watch because the people who are playing are really good at it. In fact, shout out time. There's a channel called Guitar Bros Demos, and I feel really bad for them because they got their channel hacked around 8 months ago and all their videos got deleted and they were locked out of the account. They got the account back and they're going to be uploading new videos soon, so head on over to them. I've linked them if you want to see some good demos of gear. Now with all of that said, I'm talking about specifically people who class gear as good or bad from YouTube demos. Guitar players, and myself included, are usually very picky. And guitar players, again myself included, usually take this stuff to the extreme. Sometimes a little too far. I've seen people debating on how mahogany sounds like this, but mahogany from this country sounds like this, and then they put an EMG with a $1 battery in it. I've seen other people pay $1,000 for silver wound pickups and $60 for one capacitor on their tone pot, only to plug through a $10 cable. Or a very expensive cable that's just excessively long. My point is, there are so many variables in getting tone that attributing the sound to one piece of gear isn't particularly useful. I want to show you what my rig is. The guitar I'm using for most of this is this Ormsby GTR SX. We'll be going into a few more details on this a little bit later. I'm going through a 6-meter cable into the front of my pedal board. 5 pedals excluding the Boss delay that isn't in the chain. It comes out of the board from a 3-meter cable into the front of a Victory Kraken, put through a Zilla 2x12 Super Fat Boy with 2 Celestion K100s. All of this is mic'd up with a Sub-Zero SM57 clone. First I want to show you what it sounds like when I'm bypassing the pedal board. So it's just a cable from the guitar into the front of the amp. And directly after I'm going to show you what it sounds like when the guitar signal is going through the 5 pedals, but none of them are engaged, completely bypassed. Now you can hear there that the pedals are rolling off some of the high end, so for all intents and purposes we're EQing the guitar before we even hit the front of the amp, and that's unintentional. So already if I was doing a demo of that amplifier through that pedal board, it's not going to sound the exact same. Now let's change up the guitars a little bit. This is the Ormsby GTR SX that I'm using. It's got an alder body, a Wenge neck, and an ebony fretboard. It's got stainless steel frets, and the bridge pickup is an Ormsby Hot Rock. This guitar was a Fender Mexican Strat, but it's now become more of a Warmoth parts caster. It also has an alder body and stainless steel frets, but everything else on this is completely different. It's got a baked maple neck, a rosewood fretboard, and a DiMarzio Mojo in the bridge. And finally we're going to be looking at this parts caster. It's called the TriStar, and it too is very different from the others. This one's got a poplar body with a baked maple neck and a baked maple fretboard. It's got a Seymour Duncan JB in the bridge, and this one, while it's still in the same tuning as the others, has 11s instead of 10s. Now let's hear how those guitars sound going through the same rig but with the bypass pedal board, and we'll see how those differ from each other. Now I thought that was very interesting. If that was an amplifier demo, which would sound the best to you? It was entirely dependent on what guitar I was using. Some had lower output and it was giving off a lower gain on the same setting of the amp. Some had higher outputs and were giving off that tone. So already we're seeing a lot of variables, but that's in changing the gear that you're seeing. What about the gear that isn't really talked about too much? What about microphones? This is the Sub-Zero SZM10. It's an SM57 clone. And the reason that I'm using clones today is, well, it's what I have, but it also demonstrates something that we'll be talking about later, which is even though there are industry standards, it doesn't mean they're particularly standard. You can use whatever you want, really. We'll also be taking a look at this SM58 clone. This is a Thomann T-Bone vocal mic. They call it the MB85, and we'll be comparing this to the SM57 clone. But we'll also be talking about another clone. This is a Superlux Para 628 Mark II. It's a copy of the popular Sennheiser E609 mic. And we'll also be checking this out. Now in the comparison of these, I'm going to mic them just off center of the cone of the speaker in the Zilla 2x12. That's a Celestion K100. Now you heard some differences there, and some were more favourable than others. I thought that the 57 sounded the best, the 85 sounded very shrill, and the Superlux sounded very boomy, more bass focused. I can't say I'd be particularly sold on a pedal if the demo was mic'd up with the 85. Now let's talk about mic placement and, in some senses, user error. You're not really advised to mic up a speaker on the centre of the cone, but we're going to do that, and we're going to see how that sounds. That was painful. It did not sound good really on any microphone. And that was all on me. It was no fault of the gear whatsoever. It was the placement of the mics that I did. And I did them intentionally to sound bad, but what if the person who's making the demo doesn't know how to mic up a cab properly? Let's add another variable. What about the speaker and the cab? We've been listening so far through a pretty high-end Zilla Super Fat Boy. It's made out of birch ply, and we've got some Celestion K100s. I've also got a more budget-friendly Marshall 4x12 with Marshall-branded Eminence speakers. And we're going to mic this cab up with the 3 microphones, and we're going to compare them to the Zilla. Now that was pretty interesting. The same microphones, the same mic placement, the same amp, the same guitar, the same everything. It was just the different cabs, and it had a dramatic effect on the sound. And going back to industry standards not being too standard, let's talk about speakers. A very popular, and arguably the industry standard in metal anyway, is the speaker, the Celestion Vintage 30. And a very popular way of getting a Vintage 30 is through a Harley Benton cabinet because, as it's widely advertised, the cabinets and the speaker cost less than buying the speaker on its own. The thing is, they're not exactly the same. The Celestion Vintage 30 that you buy on its own is a British-made Celestion, whereas the Vintage 30 that you get in a Harley Benton cab is the Chinese-made Vintage 30. And while there's marginal differences, there's still some differences. Now, a point I see made often in gear demos is, yeah, the demo is cool and all, but how does this piece of gear fit in the mix? And, well, on the surface, that makes perfect sense. As far as I'm concerned, that just adds more variables. I've never been part of a professional mix where there hasn't been at least a small amount of post-EQ. It's an important part of mixing. It's to make sure that everything sits well together. But to put this idea to the test, I thought let's put some gear in a mix. It's a hard left, hard right pan of rhythm guitar, and the lead is in the center with a few multitracks on certain parts. The bass is a recorded DI, and the drums are just programmed in. Now that did not sound great, but it didn't sound terrible. For this, I mic'd this up with the 57 clone, and I did a hell of a lot of post EQ and had to remove a lot of the highs to make it somewhat usable, but it was somewhat usable. And while that demo does make it seem that this crappy amp is at least somewhat usable, at least to make music, I suppose, what if I was using that sound to demonstrate the guitar that I was playing? I don't think it would make you lust after that guitar. It certainly wouldn't make me lust after guitar if it sounded like that. All the sound samples I've talked about today have been based around my listening on some fairly expensive headphones, and I was listening to the raw uncompressed audio. I don't know what you're listening on. You could be an audiophile with $3,000 headphones, or you could be just listening on your phone speakers. And even if you are listening through the $3,000 headphones, note that what you're listening to has been compressed to hell and back by YouTube before it's even got to you. The point I'm trying to make here is that demos can never be truly 100% accurate to display what a piece of gear sounds like. Don't say that gear is either good or bad based off demos. Listen to the reviewer's opinion on the piece of gear. If you trust those people's opinions, of course. So that's all I really wanted to show you today. Thank you for watching, like the video, and maybe subscribe. Bye bye.